Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this last session of the GEM Vietnam webinar series 2023. Today, we have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Sepehr Eslami from DELTARES and Dr. Nguyen Thanh Binh from the Mekong Delta Development Research Institute, Canto University. So today's topic is on the role of retention basins against salt intrusion in the Mekong Delta. As you may know, the Mekong Delta has experienced increasing salinity intrusions over the past decades, mainly driven by riverbed level erosion, as was shown in previous webinar in the previous webinar series last year. So one of the questions is, of course, what can be done to decrease these saline intrusions and their associated damages? Since the main driver is riverbed level erosion, one of the main way to decrease these intrusions is, of course, to limit this erosion, which would mean drastically decreasing sand mining in the river channels. And this should be a priority. Another option might be to use water retention basins to release fresh water during the dry season. But the question is this really realistic? Is this feasible? And this is the question we're going to investigate today. Dr. Eslami will present the modeling exercise, which was performed to investigate this question during the GEM project. So the presentation will last about 30 minutes. Then we will have about 10-15 minutes of discussion with Dr. Binh, and then the discussion will be open to the rest of the audience. So you can, of course, ask questions in the chat during the presentation, and then we will allow open question. So that's it. Sepehr, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marie-Noëlle, for the introduction, and good afternoon, Dr. Binh, and also morning and afternoon to all the participants. I would like to discuss the issue of salinity in the Mekong Delta and discuss one of the solutions that floats around, which is the use of retention basins, and go a little bit deeper into that option. For that, I need to expand on the background of salinity, on its drivers, and discuss a little bit of the context. Important to mention, this is a work we did at DELTARES together with in cooperation with our colleagues at Southern Institute Water Resources Planning. Different colleagues as listed have contributed, but I have the privilege to present this. So salt intrusion is the key to land use in the Mekong Delta, and we see more and more reports of saline water intrusion in the Delta. We need to have a look at a system analysis of salt intrusion. If we look at, let's say, a cross-sectional view through one of the estuarine channels, we have on the ocean side, we have saline water, and upstream we have fresh water. Salinity is basically the competition between the forces of river and sea. It's influenced by tides. It's influenced by sea level rise. It's influenced by wind, but by waves, and ocean surge, as well as upstream discharge, evaporation, and precipitation, and their anomalies driven by climate change. It's also influenced by fluvial sediment starvation, as well as from upstream, driven by upstream dams, as well as human activities such as significant water demand for agriculture, or sand mining that, together with upstream impoundments, results in riverbed erosion, and drives surface water intrusion. There's also groundwater extraction in the delta that results in land subsidence and also has a contribution to salt intrusion. And of course, we also have the topic of salt intrusion in the groundwater system, and groundwater extraction can also contribute to that. But if we look at a quantified image of these drivers, we have sea level rise of, let's say, 2 to 4 millimeter per year, but that is combined with land subsidence of 10 to 40 millimeter per year, which is orders of magnitude larger than land subsidence. At the same time, we have significant decline on fluvial sediment supply of, let's say, up to 95 centimeter, which together with sand mining results in riverbed erosions of 10 to 15 centimeter per year over the last 2 decades. That results in significant increasing trends in the tides by another 2 centimeter per year. And together, these all result in riverbed erosion, in increased saline water intrusion trends in the delta. So sediment starvation is the key, and riverbed changes have been the most significant driver of salinity in the last 2 decades. In fact, if we look at the 2016 event, what we notice is that if this was the realized salt intrusion, this is sort of a P90, so it's not the maximum salinity measured, but 90% of the time was below this. And if we look at that, and we did an exercise to show that if the riverbed level in the delta did not change, salinity in the year 2016 would be significantly lower, and in some places as far as 20 kilometers. So message here is that the Mekong Delta is far more vulnerable to the drought events as it was 2 decades ago. During the GEM project COP26, we did an exercise to look into different drivers of salt intrusion. We looked into scenarios that include only climate change, and we saw that up to 6 to 7% increase in areas affected by salt intrusion can be expected. If we add land subsidence, we add a few more percent, 5 or 6%, under different scenarios. But as soon as we have riverbed level changes, these increases, we could say, astronomically. So in this figure, we see the darker color at the scale of 0 to 12 shows the increased salinity at specific locations. So for instance, in Kamau province, in Kamau Batlio, as salinity is already high, we see the brighter colors, which means less increasing salinity. But the further we go from the coast, we see it getting darker, which means that the change in salinity is larger. So new areas will be influenced by salinity. This is the absolute salinity that we can expect. This is a P50, so 50% of the time. If we put that in a graph and look at the potential pathways until the year 2050, see that with climate change only, so it's sea level rise as well as upstream discharge, we do have an increase of nearly 100,000 hectares of land, but that sort of flattened towards mid-century. This increases by land subsidence, but suddenly the increase is extremely stronger when we have changes in riverbed erosion. And we can also combine these scenarios with scenarios of extreme sea level rise by mid-century. And then we can see even a more dramatic image. So the message is that it is clear that within the next 30 years, salinity will increase something between 100 to 800,000 of hectare. The areas affected by salt intrusion will increase by something like 100 to 800,000 hectare, depending on various drivers such as policy development, fluvial sediment supply, effects of sand mining, effects of groundwater extraction, and the trends that all of these activities will follow. So the conclusion is that in the short term, let's say within 2 to 3 decades, anthropogenic drivers determine the fate of the delta. Beyond 2050, the second half of the century, perhaps sea level rise and land subsidence will become more significant drivers. And of course, the challenges are that a lot of these trends are irreversible, but the opportunity is that lots of these drivers are actually human-made and can be influenced by policy making. So as salinity has been increasing, there has been discussions about retention basins, and one of the solutions that has been floating around is how we can store water to impact salinity in the peak of the dry season. This was a first attempt. Together with AFD, we did this exercise to see what the effect of water retention could be on salt intrusion. So for that, I think we need to look at a little bit the larger image of another factor that influences salinity, and that's upstream discharge. So we have the northeastern and southwestern monsoon, and we also have to look at the dynamics that the Tonle Sap Lake introduced to the delta during the wet and dry season. So in the wet season, it absorbs water, it attracts water, water is stored in the Tonle Sap Lake, and in the dry season, this fresh water is drained to the delta. So in the dry season, the Mekong Delta has 2 sources of fresh water, the Mekong River and the Tonle Sap Lake. However, if we look at cumulative discharge from the Tonle Sap Lake in different months, so January, February, March and April. In March and April, we could more or less see consistently that total discharge from the Tonle Sap Lake has always been near 0. And that's because the lake has been drained in that time. But the trends from January and February have been alarming and consistently dropping over the past decades, from 2000 to 2020. At the same time, when we look at the Mekong River discharge, we see an increasing trend of freshwater during the months of the dry season. So we have an increasing trend of freshwater in the dry season from the Mekong River, but that of the Tonle Sap Lake has been dropped dramatically. Therefore, the freshwater supply to the Mekong Delta in the dry season hasn't changed much. And let's not forget that salt intrusion takes place during the northeastern monsoon at the months that the Tonle Sap Lake is supposed to be providing freshwater to the delta. If we look at the historical trends of discharge from the Tonle Sap Lake, we see this is the range of historical data, the gray. The blue line represents an average year, 2015, which was a relatively wet year, wet or normal year, I would say average. But in the years 2016 and in the year 2020, where we experienced significant salt intrusion in the delta, this has been significantly lower than the other years. In fact, already in towards mid December and January, the lake has been drained. So this basically means that the Tonle Sap Lake plays a very important role as it comes to freshwater supply and combating salt intrusion in the delta. And this impact on from the Tonle Sap Lake results in longer saline periods in the delta and makes it, again, it's another source of vulnerability for the Mekong Delta. So I mentioned already that freshwater supply to the delta in the dry season has been following an increasing trend. This is from Cratier, discharge in Cratier. The dry season has been increasing. At the same time, mentioned that the total discharge of the Mekong Delta has hardly been changing, very weak increasing trend, but that could also be artifact of the numbers. In principle, there's not much change. And at the same time, we do see that water levels in Phnom Penh in the month of September and October, as well as the Tonle Sap Lake, that were on the rise before start of the century, at the start of the century, they start following a declining trend. So this declining trend of water level from upstream, not necessarily discharge, but water level that is mainly driven by upstream dams, has resulted in smaller storage in the Tonle Sap Lake, and hence less supply of water to the Mekong Delta. Here I highlight that if we look at the 2016 event, and if we look at the total discharge during the year during the extreme event of 2016, this historically is not the lowest discharge in the Mekong Delta. But if we look at water level in Tonle Sap Lake, then we see that water level in Tonle Sap Lake has been historically low. So this again emphasizes on the importance of water level and storage in the Tonle Sap Lake. With that in mind, and with the shortage that was experienced in the year 2016, we did a reverse engineering exercise and tried to see what would be the impact of 20 billion cubic meter, more or less, which was lacking in the year of 2016, on salt intrusion. In fact, if we compare 2016 to 2015, we did observe something like 18% increase in the areas affected by salt intrusion. But if that Tonle Sap Lake was functioning as it normally does, and there was that kind of storage in the Tonle Sap Lake, we could see significantly lower salinity in the Mekong Delta. So minus 5%, so 5% less than the year 2015, given the same discharge that was coming from the Mekong River. So if we include that kind of storage and look into, for instance, what kind of scenarios we can expect in the future. So if these are the scenarios of salinity increase in the next 3 decades under climate change, land subsidence, and riverbed erosions, these are the increasing trends of salinity that we can expect. And if we have that kind of storage, we could see significantly lower, as much as up to 7% lower salt intrusion in the next 3 decades. So in theory, this can play an important role in limiting salt intrusion. But the problem is that if we look at the discharge that this looks a little bit ugly, but so don't look at it like this. But what I want to show is that if that storage wants to be meaningful, it should follow a declining trend like this. So for instance, from January all the way to March, this retention basin, wherever it is, should supply billions of cubics of meter of fresh water in a declining manner towards March and April. So it's not like if we have the largest storage in December, and that's sufficient to manage salt intrusion in the month of February. So this is the main challenge, and like I mentioned, it has to cover more or less 2 to 3 months of freshwater to be managed. So where can we do these kind of retention? We can look at two sources. One source which has been studied is if this storage is within the Mekong Delta, within the dike rings of the upper delta, that covers an enormous area of nearly 20% of the delta has to be covered with these kind of within the dike ring to provide that kind of storage. So in fact, this is not an effective measure, and there's also all kind of other problems such as evaporation and in the dry season, and that makes it extremely unattractive. Is an extremely unattractive method for water retention. However, the Tonle Sap Lake has been historically the most important water retention basin in the Mekong River. And is there a way to manage the Tonle Sap Lake as a retention basin? So we've looked into, for instance, different diversion methods to transfer water to the Tonle Sap Lake in the wet season, so that it can provide its historical role during the dry season. But there are questions about effectiveness, and it requires significant investment and coordinations between the lower basin countries to materialize, especially between Cambodia and Vietnam, to materialize that kind of a solution. And extremely technically challenging, of course. So from this exercise, the main takeaway is that so this was the first attempt to understand the role of retention basins. They can be effective, but they are only effective if there are or if this is done in very large volumes. The retention basins within the Mekong Delta, within the agricultural lands, it's basically an unjustified land use. But there is potential, significant potential within the Tonle Sap Lake. However, creating additional retention area in the Tonle Sap Lake requires like I said, managed inflow to the delta and controlled outflow, and that needs extremely significant investments. This does not come. This is potentially an engineering solution that will not come without environmental consequences. So a thorough system analysis and environmental impact assessment would be required to come to any conclusion regarding that kind of a solution. I hope this is a quick introduction and explanation on why we think that this solution had to be studied. It's not the kind of a message that normally people come up like, this is the solution, this is the best solution. No, we actually think that this is a very complicated solution to be introduced in adaptation to salt intrusion. However, it is important that we have this message and we bring all kind of elements of the system, such as how complicated the trends of upstream discharge are, how vulnerable the Mekong Delta is, and how salt intrusion can be managed. Hope that helps, and I'm looking forward to further discussion on this.
Thank you very much, Sepehr. So we move on to the discussion part. Dr. Binh, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So now I will share the screen. So the screen, can you see it? Good?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion section. And also thank you very much, Sepehr. You have a great work for water retention study. Now I would like to discuss something related to your presentation, especially water retention, for what, yeah, and how. And then I think after my presentation, we can discuss something related to water retention issues. From your presentation, also from your report I read, I have some thing about the result. So you did a very good job and a very great result from modeling-based approach. You conclude that retention could be effective and considered. And within the Mekong Delta, it needs around 10 to 15% of surface area. And that should think about how does it work in terms of surface area needed. You also said that using toilet blade would provide a more feasible solution, but then transboundary management issue. Other measures like diversion canal or increase water level near Phnom Penh, also another approach in your calculation, and you also conclude that it's not sufficiently effective. And your calculation also show that increase of 500 to 1,000 cubic meter per second in the Mekong Delta in the dry season would be effective against salinity intrusion. This is large amount.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So that is just some review from your result. And you also report also some challenges. And the key thing is technical aspect of such solution. Environmental impact, you just mentioned, social economic factor, and political aspect also should be considered in water retention. But as I mentioned, still need to be clear. Retention for what? Yeah. Again, salinity intrusion, of course, but for what? Again, rice production, domestic use, ecosystem services, livelihood development, or what else? I couldn't see in your report, of course, because you based on modeling and computer-based approach. How to approach? Also, another question I want to discuss here. Only hard measure, as you mentioned, technical solution, yeah, or another approach, what they can call also gray solution, or soft measure, green solution, or both. We should discuss about water retention in these two key questions.
Yeah.
Because under the government resolution, we are not prevent salinity, but living with flood, living with salinity. And another approach is like integrated gray-green solution. This is just published by Dr. Thanh about water retention in terms of his argument integrated gray-green solution rather than only technical things.
Yep.
So then, there are some just example from the Mekong Delta water retention in terms of living with flood. As you see here, in the past, key farming system, rice production system is 2 crops per year, and the crop system like this visualization, so 2 crops per year. But then the people do more intensification, so 3 crops per year, and this require a lot of water and also effective downstream because they need water for this intensification. But then people realize that, so they reduce the intensification by another model, like 3-year 8 crop, or 2-year 5 crops model. So it means that if you see here more and more water retention, let's say for that area. So this kind of thing, one kind of water retention approach in terms of changing the crop pattern. And I also did the livelihood resilient analysis between these 4 farming systems, and it's clearly so that the less intensification is more resilient. As you see here, 2 crops compared to 3 crops, 2 crops compared to 3 crops. Another living with flood approach, like no flood base. For example, lotus or rice, and the same. If we compare the resilience, the 3 rice crop is very low compared to another. And in this case, we also may think that this is another approach for water retention. In terms of salinity, in the coastal area, people also change the farming system from rice to aquaculture, to integrated rice and shrimp, to deal with or to adapt to salinity intrusion by aquaculture. So in the wet season, they do rice, and in the rice season, when salinity comes, they do shrimp. And from the calculation in terms of economic, the rice shrimp is better than compared to 2 rice crops. And many paper, many research also talking about the how to say it, the environmental aspect of this farming system. So then we think to design our system, maybe from what I call here is from degenerative system to regenerative system. So it means that in this new system, it's better for environment, for people, and also in terms of energy compared to the previous one. So then water retention should be approached in different ways, not only technical, but what I call here the 5M approach. So what is the 5M? The first is the men, the people. So the knowledge, the skill and attitude of the people in terms of water value is important. So salinity is good or not good. This is threat or opportunity. It should be taken into account when you talk about water retention. Money. A lot of money if you want to invest large infrastructure, like you suggest, And this is like not only local, but also we consider national and international mechanism. It means that the institution aspect of coordination, and in this case, cost benefit sharing is very important. If you're taking into account not only within the countries, the Vietnamese Mekong Delta itself, but also transboundary between the two countries. Material, it means the technology aspect and also tool. So here it is not like soft, but also not only hard measure, but also soft measure should taking into account. And the last one is mutation. So it means that there are many things changing, but that is very high risk and uncertainty, as in your calculation also mentioned about this. And I think when we talk about water retention, we should taking into account this 5M. As conclusion, water retention, especially in the Mekong Delta, related to livelihood a lot, and environment. And this kind of thing affected by climate change. So we need a multi-level governance. This is not only a top level, but also very ground level. Maybe very first level is personal level, household level, farm level, and then higher level. And 5M approach, maybe potential approach when we talk about water retention, and regenerative design should be considered. And that is what I want to share with you from my point of view related to this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Binh. Marie-Noëlle, can I reflect on the points raised by Dr. Binh?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Indeed, it was a very thorough analysis on what would be the adaptation strategies to salt intrusion, and so I'm happy that you actually you touched upon that. The exercise on water retention basins was motivated by the fact that actually I also saw a question, what would be the impact on the communities around the Tonle Sap Lake? So Tonle Sap Lake is a very important ecosystem in the Mekong Delta, also for Cambodia. So revival of the Tonle Sap Lake and its retention role actually can have significant motivations from the Cambodian side as well. On the other hand, as we agree that there should be adaptation to live with salinity, there is also a certain level of resistance between communities, between provinces, to not change the status quo and the way of working and try to control salinity. So there are different motivations at play here. You mentioned, for instance, rice shrimp. Indeed, rice shrimp is a model that has been used, but we know that within the Mekong Delta, there are communities next to each other. One is doing rice shrimp, and one has been doing rice, and they don't want to change anything, and they prefer to build a sluice gate rather than adapt to salinity, while the overall strategy should be clear. But you know better than me that this is also a challenge, and that drives sometimes this conversation: how can we maintain salinity at the levels that are there now? And the message that we wanted to convey with this exercise was that basically it's virtually impossible. If there is enough motivation, there's a business case to revive the Tonle Sap Lake and its water level to its original status. That needs a lot of investment, and if there is that business case, which I don't know, that might be justified. But if it's not, and if it's about combating salinity, or storing water somewhere else to limit salt intrusion, that is not a feasible approach. However, if it's to adapt to salt intrusion, as you rightfully mentioned, retention, small retentions within the delta to bridge the shortage for agriculture, or retention for let's say domestic supply, because there's also shortage in the dry season domestic supply. It can be even retention in the subsurface and the groundwater. These kind of retentions, I think there are definitely merits for them. But if it's for controlling salinity, the main message was that that's not a solution. And then you nicely elaborated on your 5M approach, 5M diagram, that it actually needs a whole of society approach to adapt to salinity. And there are, of course, different resistance forces and different motivations. But this, as I mentioned, was the first attempt to, from a certain angle, to convey the message that controlling salinity, given the trends we're observing, is most probably not an option at all. And even if we decide to, for instance, build, well, tens of sluice gates to control, as the period of salinity during the delta gets longer and longer, the functionality of the sluice gates become more and more on the question, because when there are longer periods of salinity, then this connection of the canals, this primary and secondary irrigation canals, to the main river network system causes significant water quality problems. So yeah, there are different angles to this, yeah, I'm happy if there are other questions, if you have additional remarks. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree with you that there are many things to discuss related to these issues. But the thing is that at least you give some, modeling, some result to show that this is one of the approach to think about. But then, if we take it into the practice, we should consider many things. And as also mentioned that at the beginning, you just said water retention for salinity intrusion, for salinity control. But then if we think about living with salinity, there are something different. And then if that is the case, in your calculation, in your modeling, you should put it in different scenario, living with salinity at different level. And then what is the result from your modeling? It will more helpful for policy maker to think about what kind of things should be in case of your first result. Of course, this is very preliminary result. You see, you calculate the whole picture for salinity intrusion. But then if you put living with salinity in some scenario, your result is very helpful, very perfect.
So if I the scenarios of living with salinity is basically what we developed in the COP26 report, that we projected what could be the salt intrusion scenarios in the next 3 decades. So what we did here, we used those scenarios and we looked at, okay, let's assume that we want to create enough retention against that salinity to control, and not to adapt, to control. And what would be the result? So this is this exercise. But living with salinity, it's basically, if I understand your point, is to accept what is coming and examine the options to, for instance, change the crop patterns, or change the crops all over, and those kind of measures. And that then, those are not for this kind of modeling, but I think there are different types of model that look into those. So yeah, indeed, indeed, most likely that's the direction that we will be going. But there are, as it's such a multidisciplinary topic, I think there will be a lot of ideas floating around, and we wanted to basically say, rather than this is a solution, we wanted to basically say this is not a solution and this is not the way of thinking. And we have to, as you mentioned, live with salinity and accept that it's increasing, and indeed change our strategies in terms of agriculture and adaptation measures.
But then the cost benefit should be the calculation, because when you do with the rice, it's very different with rice stream or shrimp. Yeah, and the calculation from modeling is just put hydrological factor, and the social factor, economic factor is not included in the calculation.
No, indeed, it's not. Yes, yeah, you're right. No, we did not think we did not look into the economic implications. Next step.
Yeah.
Next gem, COP28.
Yeah, maybe phase 2 of the project.
Yeah, exactly, indeed.
Thank you very much to both of you. I suggest we move to the question of the audience, if any. So you can, I think you can raise your hands somewhere if you want to ask question directly, and we will let you speak. Let me. Linha, can you allow people to speak? There's a question from Thuy.
Yes, I already allow her to speak.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Sepehr and Dr. Binh. I enjoy much the discussion. So my point is exactly what was discussed, and I have a bit more things to say about when we look at the salinity, and we have to look also at the drought and the floods, because they are all linked. Linked from the discharge of the Mekong, from Tonle Sap, everything. And so this we need to work on together in order to have a different angle to look at the same thing. Thank you. Just that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thuy. Indeed, flood and drought are both ends of the same hydroclimatic spectrum, and indeed we cannot look at one of them independent of the other one. Although this is normally the case, and most of the time drought, the topics associated with droughts are addressed by different agencies compared to those of flood. But hopefully this multidisciplinarity will materialize as most scientists are coming out of their silos and talking together, like in this platform.
Yeah, thanks, Sepehr.
Thank you.
Is there any other question in the audience? Please do not hesitate to raise your hand or write in the chat as you wish. No?
There was one question that was written by Mr. or Miss Amaral, F. Amaral, I'm not sure. What would be the impact on the communities that live in the Tonle Sap Lake? There are 170 villages and 80,000 people on the lake. That's an extremely important question, which I have no answer to. But what I can say is that one of the main challenges of all those 80,000 people is the low water levels of the Tonle Sap Lake over the last couple of years. So, as Dr. Binh rightfully mentioned on the economic implications and the cost benefit, at some point that will be considered whether raising the water levels at Tonle Sap Lake is financially justified given the livelihood of those 80,000 people that live around the lake and are threatened by the hydrological regime shift in the Mekong River basin. So it's complicated in that sense, which I think, so if you look at the perspective of those 80,000 people, there should be motivation to make sure water levels are rising. However, the mechanisms of rising that, if it's not from upstream, there are a lot of technical and potentially grain-gray solutions for that, which in the report we have touched upon a few of them. But like said, it needs a detailed environmental impact assessment and also cost-benefit analysis to see at some point how this could be effective. So there is motivation from the Vietnamese side for that, because that could help reduce salinity, and there should be motivation on the Cambodian side to increase retention in the Mekong, in the Tonle Sap Lake. So there are benefits for both sides. However, whether this is enough to generate a transboundary cooperation to come to that, it needs further studies.
Thank you very much, Sepehr, for this very complete answer. Okay, so if there is no additional question, I will close this session. No regrets? Okay. So I would like to thank you again very much, both Sepehr and Dr. Binh, for this very interesting discussion. So the webinar has been registered, so it will be also, you can also see it on YouTube in a few days. You will receive the link. So this session actually closes the GEM Vietnam webinar series, but it's not the very end around GEM project, because surely other webinars will be organized in the coming years, since a second GEM Vietnam project is about to start, which will focus on extreme events, energy transition, and social aspects of the energy transition in Vietnam. So many more very interesting results to come surely. So thank again, everyone. I wish you a very nice day, and I hope to see you again in future events.
Thank you very much, Manuel.
Thank you very much.